is this story. U.S. to expand troop presence in Taiwan for training against the China threat. The U.S. is markedly increasing the number of troops deployed to Taiwan, more than quadrupling the current number to bolster a training program for the island's military amid a rising threat from China. The U.S. plans to deploy between 100 and 200 troops to the island in the coming months, up from 30 there a year ago, according to U.S. officials. The larger force will expand the training program the Pentagon has taken pains not to publicize, as the U.S. works to provide Taipei with the capabilities it needs to defend itself without provoking Beijing. Stop worrying about provoking Beijing. It's not like they don't know. It's not like their, quote, wolf warrior diplomats aren't poking their eye in America every day. They are. And now they're thinking about lethal aid for Ukraine. And that will escalate the war there. But do not worry about what your enemy is going to do. That's appeasement. Trying to beg them not to do things and worrying about what their feelings. It's what led to this catastrophe in Ukraine a year ago is the perceived weakness of President Biden after he skedaddled from Afghanistan with 13 dead American troops in his wake and tens of thousands of abandoned green card holders, American citizens, SIV-eligible people. Weakness breeds conflict. Strength doesn't. So this is a good move. Don't worry about publicizing it. A federal judge has ordered depositions of former President Trump, FBI Director Wray, in a long-running dispute with ex-FBI official. It's not ex-FBI, it's Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. They disparaged the president in private messages about him. They claim they have proved that FBI bias fueled the Russia probe. Trump has said that forever. He said it to me. The former president said it to me recently. And, of course, he's angry with Strzok and Page. And I don't know what they intend to do, but they get deposed, too, in the course of this thing. So while you might be focused on the potential deposition, 2 hours limited to a precise set of questions, don't be. Understand that Strzok and Page are going to come under endless discovery. And they're counting on you to not pay attention to it. They're trying to change the narrative because their reputations are shattered. They lost their job. And the question is whether or not they're going to be able to persuade anyone that Donald Trump did something wrong. And that is not going to be the case. Other headlines. In the fog of East Palestine's crisis, politicians write their own stories, according to the New York Times. CNN did a town hall. I missed it on Thursday night from East Palestine. And it's 40 miles south of Warren, where I grew up. It's a fine little town, about 5,000 people, high school. The East Palestine Bulldogs have about 300 people in it. It's just an amazing place to go and to grow up. But I will tell you this. I used to go down there when the basketball team would go. We would normally play East Palestine in tournaments at the end of the year. That's what I know about. It's not much because they were 40 miles away, a little bit down the road. But it was a beautiful town. And Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg ignoring it until yesterday is pretty extraordinary. Now, Pete Buttigieg did speak to it yesterday, cut number 10.
Okay, so here we are. We're 1 year into this thing, and I think the key question is, what do we do now? Number one, we continue to provide significant military capability, and that, in my view, would include fighter aircraft, notably MiG-29, F-16, both can be done. There are some naysayers that say, oh, it'll take a long time to train to fly the F-16. I don't know. These are trained combat pilots. We're not trying to turn Hugh Hewitt into a fighter ace. We're trying to get something.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's the armaments to include ATACMS, the combat aircraft, the longer range cruise missiles to go after the Black Sea Fleet, all of that. Number two, we continue to push on the sanctions. And over time, that is going to have significantly more impact on Russia. And let's face it, the global energy economy is kind of rewiring itself in front of us. But long term, the economics are deeply against Russia. Point being that if you look at the global economy, on one side, U.S., Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, South Korea, Singapore, add all that up, that's about 65% of global gross domestic product. On the other side is Russia, which has maybe 2%, less than that now. And even if China completely throws in, which I don't think they will, but if they do, it's still only another 15% on that side of the equation. So over time, big big storm clouds economically. And third and finally, Hugh, we've got to keep the diplomatic pressure on. And here where I'm worried is China. I'm concerned China may make a mistake here and begin supplying weapons, real military capability to Russia. Again, I think President Xi is too smart to do that, but that is the path of greatest worry. So there's three things we should be thinking about today on this anniversary.
Admiral, I reminded my friend Kurt Schlichter the other day that China did not hesitate to throw hundreds of thousands of troops into Korea when they thought their strategic interests were threatened by MacArthur's advance of the Yalu River. And so if their strategic interests are threatened, they will act in their own best interest. But I don't think they are. Are they by Putin's defeat? Would they actually have their strategic interests threatened?
No, I don't think so. And frankly, I could spin that the other way in two dimensions. One is it's been 70 years since the Korean War. That's a long time ago. Point being, Xi can't have a high degree of confidence one way or the other in the Chinese military, point one. Point two, and more to the question of the strategic interest of China, I can make the case that a badly wounded, limping Russia with a absolutely cracked military coming out of this conflict presents a real opportunity for China. Think about it this way, Hugh. If you're China, you're looking north at Siberia. It's this vast landmass. This is Russia to the east of the Ural Mountains, and nobody lives there. There's, 25 million people in an area the size of the continental United States. But what's it full of? Oil, gas, timber, arable land, fresh water, diamonds, gold, rare earths. It looks mighty tasty if you're Chinese, and a weakened Russia presents some interesting strategic opportunities to China.
Now, Admiral, when the Chinese talk about the century of humiliation, it includes Russia taking their northern province, doesn't it?
It does. And, there's not a natural gravitational pull, frankly, between China and Russia. You provide one pretty good instance of it. Let's not forget during the Cold War, these two communist powers were never significantly aligned, had many disagreements, including philosophies of communism, but all the way to borders and geopolitics, as you correctly point out. And oh, by the way, go back to 55 days at Peking, as it was called then, now Beijing, and it's all part of the humiliation of China, which included Russia.
Now, let me talk to you before our audience goes off. Moldova is under an extraordinary... Have you been to Moldova? I'm going to be astonished if you've been to Moldova.
Hugh, of course I've been to Moldova. I've been, I think, twice, maybe three times. Don't forget, it's part of the U.S. European Command's orbit. Its area of responsibility, as it's called. So I've been at least twice. It's one of the poorest countries, perhaps the poorest country in Europe. And the problem, its major problem, is about a third of its territory is already occupied by Russia, which has set up this kind of puppet regime there called Transnistria. And over the last few weeks, we've seen, I think, pretty credible reports that Russia is seeking to undermine the government in Chisinau, which is the capital. So here's the point. Russia is not only making moves on Ukraine, they're making moves on this tiny, impoverished country, Moldova, and they are also quite clearly intent on simply absorbing Belarus, which is a pretty big nation just to the north of Ukraine. The whole thing is part of Putin's, quote, master plan, unquote, to reconstitute as much as he can of the old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus, of course, were all part of that.
Now, I know Moldova's elected prime minister does not want that. And I know that Russian propaganda is saying they're threatening the ammunition depot that the Russians control in that Transnistria, whatever it is called. But does Belarus want to be absorbed? They've got their own little dictator going there. Does he want to give everything over to Putin?
Yeah, this is Lukashenko, who often jokes about who's the bigger, badder dictator. It's also kind of amusing to see him and Putin stand next to each other because Putin's a tiny guy like I am, and his fellow dictator in Belarus just towers over him. He looks like Shaquille O'Neal standing next to Danny DeVito. But the point is, I think generally the Belarusians, the population has no desire to be absorbed by Russia. The majority of that population pretty clearly wants to lean to the West. They've tried to overthrow their dictator several times. He has cracked down with help from Moscow. This is another one of the color revolutions, but one that didn't really take off. Came very close about 2 years ago, just before pandemic times. The bottom line is that Belarus would like to remain an independent country, but I think Putin has other ideas for them.
I want to close, Admiral, because you were the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. The only good thing that's come out of a war that's claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and destroyed Ukraine is it brought NATO together. It is going to bring Finland and Sweden into NATO. Poland, I read 2 days ago, is going to put 4% of their GDP into becoming the largest standing army in Western Europe. What do you think about the unintended consequences of this war on NATO, which you used to lead?
Yeah, that distant boom you hear is Vladimir Putin's head exploding with frustration. And these are all immensely unintended consequences from the perspective of Moscow, and you've ticked them off very well. Of all of them, I think the most significant potentially is Poland, which has a great deal of antipathy for Russia, a long bad history with the Cossacks and the Russians, and for them to stand up and move forward strongly, vital. Germany is moving along as well, has created a special fund with billions in it. Sweden and Finland, quite correct, they're going to present Putin with a new 800-mile frontier, plus put pressure on his plans for the Arctic. So the silver lining here in this horrific war is, in fact, NATO unity.
Admiral James Stavridis, thank you for joining me this morning. Follow him at StavridisJ on Twitter. He's also often on the media. Always tune in, put down whatever you're doing, listen to the Admiral when he comes on to talk about whatever it is he's talking about, because he knows of which he speaks. He's been to Moldova. One of these days, I'm going to find a place on the planet he hadn't been that's going to be in the headlines. I can't go testing him just to see if he's been to.
Point. And there are some pretty big foreign policy topics on the plate at the moment. As someone who's looked at US foreign policy and grand strategy at large, where do you think Washington's gaze is diverted at the moment?
Well, I think it's directed primarily at China, that these days the U.S. does, by and large, the American political class, so to speak, sees China as the biggest long-term concern for American foreign policy. I don't see any desire for a war with China, exactly the opposite. Americans aren't looking for a way to win a war with China. They're looking for a way to avoid a war with China while preserving the independence of countries on China's frontiers and preserving the peace in the region. And hopefully, at some point in the not too distant future, in Beijing, people will come to the conclusion that Deng Xiaoping had it right, and peaceful rise is the smart path for China.
Well, let's certainly hope so. You're obviously in Australia now. So for Australian listeners, how high up the list of priorities in Washington is Australia right now?
Australia is a country that, for Americans, is really very far away. I remember just how far away it was on my flight over here. But it's a country Americans just instinctively like. If you say to an American kid, we're going to Australia, they get really happy and excited. And Australia for Americans, is almost a canary in the coal mine. If Australia is telling us we don't feel secure, to Americans, that's a sense that things are going badly wrong in the Indo-Pacific. But I would have to say right now, Australia is one of many canaries that are singing this song. If you go to Japan, of course, if you go to Taiwan, if you go to the Philippines, to Australia, to India, you're going to hear a lot of concern. And that, I think, that collective sense of fear and concern that things might be headed in the wrong direction, which we do hear from Australia, we hear from everybody, and that really has attracted our attention.
Yes, it does feel like if you are President Biden or you're sitting in the foreign policy making circles in Washington, there is a tremendous amount to draw your attention at the moment. And of course, part of that is directed to Europe and what's going on with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine is able to follow the example of Israel in the late 1940s and defeat the Goliath that is attacking it. Let's hope so. But how do you feel? Is there a consensus of views in Washington about what to do about Ukraine and how that's going to turn out?
Well, there's certainly a very strong consensus that we want to help Ukraine, and that there's not a lot of doubt in Washington that if you're trying to ask who's right and who's wrong, Ukraine is right and Russia is wrong. And at the same time, which side does America want to win? The answer is Ukraine. Then it gets a little trickier. Does America want to risk a nuclear war with Russia in order to help Ukraine? Well, that's a much harder conversation to have, and you can find a lot of divergence. But then also, there's a sense, too, that I think the Ukrainians have surprised everyone. I've been to Ukraine many times, actually not as many times as I've been to Australia, but I've been to Ukraine a number of times, including in 1990 when it was still part of the Soviet Union. I drove across Ukraine from the far east to the far west and really saw a good deal of the country. Most observers didn't think that the Ukrainian army would put up this kind of a fight or that the Ukrainian government could work as effectively as it has, and that's inspired people. You know, when you see a nation that's invaded and it rallies and it's really doing everything it can to survive, it makes people want to help it.
Yes, no, I mean, I think there is tremendous public sympathy and support for Ukraine, and that's evident here in Australia as well. Despite the public sympathy here in Australia, and I was in the UK recently, and Ukrainian flags are flying everywhere. Of course, there are around the world different views of Ukraine and what's happening there. Do you have any sense on where global opinion is moving on Ukraine?
You know, that's one of the things I think those of us in the kind of Western bubble, so to speak, have a hard time understanding. But I look at Brazil. And Lula and Bolsonaro agree on almost nothing, but both of them kind of lean toward Russia rather than toward Ukraine. And both of them are deeply skeptical of the West's attitudes toward the conflict. You go to India and you'll hear the same thing from people who share our concerns about China, who have a very different view of what's happening in Ukraine. And I think we in the quote West, and I don't know, when you're in Australia, these words lose all their meaning. Are we the global North, the global West? Where the heck are we right now? But what people often refer to as the global South is probably more alienated from the quote rules-based world order than I've seen in many years. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos a couple of weeks ago and heard the Secretary General of the United Nations talk about the enormous gap. And this really worries me. I think we need to think a lot harder and a lot deeper. You know, you think about COVID came, and the rich countries did a lot to protect their citizens, whether it was vaccines, whether it was support for their industries, payments to the unemployed who lost their jobs. Poor countries didn't get this. And maybe some vaccines, but you have a country like Thailand, say, where what a high percentage of its GDP comes from tourism. And there's no tourism for 3 years. The world order did not respond in a constructive way to the needs of people around the world under COVID. Again, with the Ukraine conflict, when prices of fertilizer and food and fuel have been very high, rich countries have taken care of their own. They have not done much for the poor. Now, you can argue, and I think it's reasonable to say that it's not clear why an American taxpayer should send money to Nigeria, where perhaps it might be stolen, the corruption might be high. You can see all of these arguments, but nevertheless, if we're going to talk about a world order, we have to think a bit harder about how it benefits people at all levels of society in all parts of the world.
Absolutely. We'll have to stop very soon, but I was going to squeeze in just one final short question, which is I think one of the things that binds the US and the Australian people is this sense of optimism about the future. I come from Europe, and perhaps inherit that European pessimism, but are there grounds to be optimistic about the future? You've been studying world affairs for a long time. How dangerous a period is this, and is there grounds for hope?
We're in a very dangerous period. I think we should not underestimate this. And it's not just in Ukraine that a mistake or a poor move could lead to war. But fundamentally, I really am an optimist. I think that what we're going through right now is, it's a cliche almost to say we're having the information revolution, but we don't think enough about what that means. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world. Every institution, from the family to the religious denomination to the state to the firm, has been upended by the Industrial Revolution. The same thing is happening in the Information Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is making humanity unimaginably rich compared to the past. The average person today in a country like Australia or America lives better than Louis XIV in the Palace of Versailles. We have nicer clothes. We have much better dentists. We have, everything is so much better in those ways. The Information Revolution, I think, is going to unlock even greater productivity and make us as rich in services as we are in goods. That change is going to elevate people all over the world. But it's not going to come easy, and we're going to see the same sorts of stresses and upheavals that the Industrial Revolution has brought. So I'm an optimist, but also a